just to quickly hand it off to those that will be really running the meeting. But thanks everyone for joining by phone. Let us know if you're having any problems hearing or seeing things that you need to be. And thrilled to have everybody else around the table. It's a nice sunny day here in the JPB office. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dana, for that opening. Welcome everyone to the People's Just Transition, community-led and community-centered. CJ came down this weekend in observance of the 5th year since Sandy devastated communities in this area. And we marched with a wave, an ocean of people across the Brooklyn Bridge to honor the communities that have been standing up for climate justice. And in these 3 months alone, we've witnessed storms and fires that have made us all realize that just transition is not just something that we want to see in the future, but that we need it now. And so we wanted to hold these briefings around just transition for us to work together and figure out how we align around a just transition that isn't just a transition, but is a just transition. And so, you know, we have communities from the Climate Justice Alliance also going to COP23. We've got about 16 delegates that are going to be there to show and present the different voices of the climate justice communities here in the U.S. We want to welcome folks that are coming in. Feel free to kind of sit around the table, and there's more seating in the back. But we're, at the same time as this delegation that's going to COP23, going to be also launching a publication that shares some of our solutions for both the municipal and local level, but also share some of the deep concerns that we have for the direction that these international agreements are moving into and the effects that they have for equity at the front lines. We can change the slide. All right. So I'm Angela Grad. I'm the Executive Director of the Climate Justice Alliance. I've been in this role for about a year. And CJ began as an alignment process by EJ-based building organizations, movement support organizations, and alliances that make up the ecosystem necessary to move forward a just transition away from this extractive system to one that's more regenerative. Together, we're working on making just transition real on the ground. We're also working to amplify the center of gravity towards climate justice in these climate conversations. And then we're also influencing the shift of resources to grassroots, because we deeply believe that groups on the ground need to be resourced directly. And they need to have self-determination, because ultimately they have the solutions that will actually influence local and regional policy. We're working to build a bigger we with allies in our sector that includes the philanthropy sector, to arrive to a just transition and encourage all the sectors to also evaluate your own role, the power and the influence that you have in moving a just transition forward. I want to extend a deep gratitude to the JPB Foundation and Mertz Gilmer Foundation for their generous offer to co-sponsor the first of our 4-part series. Whoa, wonderful to see everyone here. We've got we've got more seating here in the back. Thank you for joining us. We're just getting started. I think about 100 or so people called in, and we have a full house here. So thank you very much, JPB, for hosting the space. I want to mention that the webinar series is actually a collaborative with many allies from various sectors, including the Building Equity and Alignment Initiative. They're hosting a 3-day Just Transition Forum in Jackson, Mississippi on February 26, 2018. And if you don't know the B by now, but they're guided by the HEMES principles for democratic organizing. It brings together leaders from powerful grassroots movements, influential national NGOs, and progressive philanthropists to build a stronger environmental movement. For more information around the Just Transition Forum that's going to be happening in February, you can reach out to Nanda Litan or anyone from the CJA space. Molly Greenberg is at the table here in the corner if you want to hear more about that after the presentation. Our speakers today form part of the CJA Just Transition leadership. There are many, many more leaders that are not at the table or in this room, and we honor their contributions to our movement. In this order, you're going to hear from Michelle Mascarenas, here to my left, from Movement Generation. Also, Tom Goldtooth from Indigenous Environmental Network. Lisa Abbott from Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. And Jesus Vasquez, who's traveling from Puerto Rico from Organización Boricua. Subsequent briefings is going to give us an opportunity to feature more leadership, but we thought this was a good start for the first, focusing on the principles and the process of a just transition. And we'll be giving some note cards. You might find a note card where you are now to be listing down the questions that you might get as presenters are presenting. And then you can share those with Rachel at the end, who's going to be hosting our question and answer part of the briefing. So without further ado, we're going to present Michelle Mascarenas, who's the co-director and the collective member of Movement Generation. Movement Generation just released an incredible web TV series that's titled The North Pole. It evaluates the connections between gentrification and climate change. So we highly recommend that you see it. I think it's northpole.org. The northpole.com. Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Angela. Really excited to be with you all today. I was reflecting that it was in January of 2014 when CJA had our first briefing for funders here in New York City. And a lot has happened in those 3 years, and even just in the last 6 weeks. I'm really grateful to Jesus for coming from Puerto Rico to be with us today, to be able to share some of what's going on there, because of course it's really clear that we are in the midst of the transition. And there's no question that inequity is a core driving force in the way that the transition is turning out right now. And it's crucial to invest in the communities on the front lines to address the climate crisis, but really the crisis of the economy. So again, I'm Michelle Mascarenas with Movement Generation, Justice and Ecology Project. Like Angela said, we are a movement support organization. You know, all movement support organizations do different things. What our role is supporting framing and training work for the leaders of grassroots organizations. We do train the trainers and curriculum development in concert, especially with Climate Justice Alliance members, like the folks here at this table. We support building strategic vehicles for our groups to collaborate together. And we work on culture shift work like the North Pole. So those are some of the things that we do. And in your packets, you'll find a zine, you don't need to look at it now, but called the Just Transition Strategy Framework that I'm going to share a little bit about today. And for those of you that are on the phone, you can also download this after the call from our website. It's called From Banks and Tanks to Cooperation and Caring, a strategic framework for a just transition. And I just want to name that this framework comes out of the decades and decades and really hundreds of years of work that communities on the front lines of this extractive economy have been doing and sharing with each other, and what we've learned from our conversations and lessons from those places, from those grassroots communities. And so our work has been just kind of writing it down in a way that we can all have a shared framework, kind of a shared playbook, right, to move from. So with that, great. So I just wanted to start by saying economy, the root of the word economy is eco. And that comes from the Greek word oikos, meaning home. And so economy really just means management of home. We often think of GDP or, you know, unemployment rates or money or capital, but eco just means home. Economy means management of home. And the core thing that humans have to bring to the management of home is our labor, right? All living things, you know, take energy from the sun and convert that energy into work. And that work is what produces the basis of wealth. So again, resources plus work, resources meaning clean air, you know, the living soil, clean water, all of the things that we need, forests, et cetera, to create, to work towards a purpose of the economy, of an economy, any economy really. That has to be rooted in some stories and songs and traditions and language systems. We call that culture and cosmology, or a worldview that makes that all make sense. And it's tied together by systems of governance, right? That's how we organize an economy. So let's start with where we are. Uh-oh, that just went black.
Yeah, the folks on the webinar can't be progressing.
Oh, okay. Okay, so the economy that we currently are in is really one, the dominant economy. Again, there's actually many forms of economy that coexist together, but the dominant economy is one rooted in extraction. The extraction of resources, we talk about this as dig, burn, dump. We're all familiar with it. Combining that with the most precious of resources, human labor, that is acquired through exploitation towards a purpose. The purpose is really key here because there's no other reason you would use these forms except that the purpose of the economy is the ever expansion and enclosure of wealth and power. That only makes sense, really, within a system, a worldview in which radical individualism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and a kind of colonial mindset, that there is some way that we can get resources from or send garbage to or pollution to, you know, that mindset is really what drives this extractive economy and makes it make sense, right? So the stories that we're taught from the time that we're kids is that, you know, we have all this freedom, but actually here in the United States, freedom to choose, right? But that is really just a choice between what is served up to us on the shelves of a consumer landscape, and not the choice really to choose meaningful work that is in concert with our, you know, in alignment with our purpose, with our families, with our communities, and with the ecosystems that we depend on. And instead, we're taught to buy into a mindset of enclosure, right? We get our own little plot of land, and, you know, that's what we're meant to protect. And in that way, we serve this larger system of enclosure. And so that is a mindset, a culture and cosmology that must be uprooted in order to address this extractive economy that is the root of this climate crisis. Now, that all is held together by governance. We don't see governance as separate from the economy. We actually think that form follows function. And so the governance structure is actually created to serve the purpose of the economy, again, enclosure of wealth and power. And that is one of corporate, you know, domination and militarism. Hey, Farhad. That's okay. Thank you. So, so it's important to talk about this because if we are just to, if we're just to look at what it means to address the climate crisis within this extractive economy, we may get to 100% renewables. We can push for 100% renewables and still be in an extractive system that is disrupting and destroying the life support systems of this planet. And so what's crucial is that we shift to living economies in which the purpose is ecological and social well-being, where, I think I'm teaching to do that, where the resources are not acquired, but are really supported in, in a cooperative and regenerative way, right? The relationship between human labor and the way that we're interacting with the living world around us is done in alignment with this purpose of ecological and social well-being. That must be rooted in a whole new worldview that's rooted in sacredness and caring, and in governance systems that are in alignment with deep democracy. So self-determination and sovereignty are core, and they're actually some of the drivers that will help, they're the levers really of how we achieve climate justice. I'm going to jump, so again, shifting from an extractive economy to living economies. Strategies I know we're going to talk about in the next funder briefing, so I'll skip this slide. Hopefully you'll all join that. And then the one I want to just end on is the principles for a just transition. So CJA members have been working hard over the last year, are continuing to vet a set of principles with their memberships around the nation. And these are some of the principles that we are advancing. In other words, it's not enough to say we got to move from an extractive economy to a living economy. We know that that process is the process of navigating contradictions. So every step we take must be rooted in a set of principles in which we are working towards these concepts. So buen vivir is a concept of living well without living better than somebody else, right? We can do that. It means creating meaningful work, right, in which peoples are able to self-determine. It means equitable redistribution of resources and power, right, where those resources have been concentrated and controlled in the hands of a few, and shifting that back to the communities where the decisions need to be made, right, so that it's not those far from the impacts of the decisions that are getting to make those, but instead the communities where those impacts are being felt. That is the way that we're going to actually address this crisis. It means we've got to advance ecological restoration and put our labor to work doing that. A just transition retains and restores culture and tradition, and it must advance local, regional, national, and international solidarity. Yeah, we can stop there. Yeah, thank you. Not sure. Am I passing it over to you? Yeah, great, great.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks to our hosts and to all of you who've joined us today. My name is Lisa Abbott, and I am an organizer with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, and we often refer to ourselves as KFTC, that's the acronym. And I'm going to describe one of the ways that our organization is working to try to live out and embody the just transition principles that Michelle just walked us through, while also navigating the contradictions and complexities of a particular place through a project that we call Empower Kentucky. KFTC is a community of people inspired by a vision, working together to build new power. And we mean new power sort of in every sense of the word, certainly new energy power, also new economic power, and absolutely new political power, to improve the quality of life for all people. And we are a grassroots organization with approximately 11,000, a little more than 11,000 members, and 13 chapters that now span across our state. Sorry. Kentucky's economy and our political landscape have long been dominated by a single energy source, that source being coal. Together with West Virginia and Wyoming, we've been among the top 3 coal-producing states for decades, and until 2 years ago, well over 90% of our electricity consumption, our electric power, came from burning coal. Yet in Kentucky, as in elsewhere, we are currently experiencing rapid and disruptive changes right now today in our energy system, with more right on the horizon. And the question for us as an organization, and certainly for the communities that we work in, is can we shape a just transition through a process that is place-based, vision-oriented, generative, and that builds political will for the kinds of changes that are necessary? Or will our energy transition be something that's done to us, that happens to our communities, and that is centered on false solutions, further exploitation, and continued corrupt political power? That's really the choice. It is not, do we shift or do we not shift to new energy? It really is, will the process be just? And so when the Obama administration issued the Clean Power Plan in 2015, political leaders from both of our major parties told voters that it was a death sentence for our state. Both candidates for governor that year vowed that if it was upheld by the courts, Kentucky would not comply. And so KFTC members stepped into that gap. We decided that we would work to shape a people's energy plan for Kentucky and would show that it is possible to deliver better results in terms of jobs, health, average energy bills, and a just transition, while also doing our part to protect the climate. We took about a year, the first year of the project, to design and organize an inclusive, creative process that engaged thousands of people in conversations about our energy choices and future. Our process started with deep dive trainings to build a shared analysis and understanding among a diverse set of our own members and leaders. We did more than 50 interviews with stakeholders and allies across the state, and eventually we organized community conversations in every congressional district to gather feedback. Later, as a draft of our plan came into view, we held a summit where we invited everyone who had been involved, plus anyone else interested, to come together, hear about the big ideas that were emerging in the plan, and give additional feedback. To give you a feel for the process, let me briefly describe the community conversations that were held. We called these events a seat at the table, and each one featured a free local foods dinner, a brief presentation about our energy system and the way it was changing, and then we asked, then participants spent 1 hour talking together at their table about 4 questions. The first question we asked was, we asked every participant in the room to share a 3-minute story about their relationship to Kentucky's energy system, which at first produced nervous laughter, and then like, are you serious? And then deep stories emerged about asthma, about trouble paying for bills, about the jobs people had, or the jobs they lost, or the jobs they wanted, their grandfather with black lung. It was really a rich conversation. And then from there we asked, what's your vision for Kentucky's energy future? What do you think it will take? And how can we move in that direction without leaving people or communities behind? Seats were free, but had to be reserved in advance. Every event was sold out for a total of 750 participants. We worked intentionally to invite and involve a diverse cross-section of our communities. Participants included low-income folks, people affected by environmental injustice, people working in the oil, coal, and gas industries, as well as folks working in energy efficiency and renewable energy, farmers, religious leaders, young folks, people of color, some political leaders, and 2 CEOs of utility companies. This word cloud is a representation of the answers we received when we asked people to describe their vision for Kentucky's energy future. It's clear, even at a glance, that Kentuckians, by and large, want a future based in diverse, affordable, and locally owned clean energy options. We want good, meaningful, clean energy jobs in our communities, and we want a just transition for affected workers and affected places. As part of our planning process, we also developed an environmental justice analysis for the state of Kentucky. The Clean Power Plan recommends but doesn't require that states do an EJ analysis, and it was important to our membership that our plan be informed by an understanding of which communities in our state are most affected by cumulative pollution and bad health conditions today, and to better understand the relationships between race, poverty, pollution, and health in our state and across our communities. That process was led by an amazing 23-year-old woman from central Kentucky who's also both a farmer and a cartographer, and a team of local volunteers. And they gathered Kentucky-specific data to supplement data provided by the US EPA and produced a broader EJ analysis. This is just one of many maps that they produced. It shows that the colors show the communities that are most affected by cumulative pollution in our state, including but not limited to pollution from our energy sector. And then just briefly, the dots are the location of coal-fired power plants. So you can see in the east, we have 100 years of coal extraction and oil and gas drilling. And in the west, we have coal extraction, and those are the concentration of coal plants along the river. And then Louisville is sort of halfway up the spine of the western side, and you can see the pollution that is both coal burning power plants and transportation pollution and industrial pollution. A group of KTC members then worked for many months to develop a plan that reflects the best of the input we received, the best of the research that we did about policies and practices from other places, and they worked to then take all of that and shape a plan that is informed by our EJ analysis and by the just transition principles that Michelle described and our own version of them. The final plan was released last April and can be found at empowerkentucky.org. It's loaded with homegrown solutions that fall broadly under 7 chapters or 7 headings. I will not go into the details. You're welcome to read them yourself, but just briefly, the recommendations included how can we accelerate energy efficiency and renewable energy across our economy? Of course it did. It also includes a set of recommendations about what can Kentucky do to create jobs in most affected communities and support a just transition. How can our plan, what steps are needed to prioritize health and racial and economic equity? How can we prioritize local solutions, building local ownership and making sure that benefits go to local communities? How can we fully and fairly invest in most affected communities and EJ communities, meet our obligations to act on climate? And then how can we engage everyone to begin the transformation of other systems? Because this plan is only talking about our electricity sector, and clearly there's much more to do. We then took, we worked closely with consultants at Synapse Energy Economics to then take just 4 key elements of that plan that their computer model could manage. And we wanted to analyze if we implemented our plan compared to the business as usual case, the do nothing scenario, over the next 15 years, what would the outcomes be? So we took 4 key recommendations from the plan. And here's the big story, right? By implementing those 4 elements of the broader plan over the next 15 years, in Kentucky, we would produce more jobs, lower bills, and better health than the business as usual or do nothing scenario, while investing nearly $400 million in just transition for affected workers and communities, and reducing CO2 pollution from our power sector by 40%. As context, the Clean Power Plan required us to cut our emissions by 31%. Our plan would also result in a cleaner and more diverse energy system in Kentucky over the 15 years, including more solar and wind, especially more distributed solar, less new natural gas infrastructure, and less coal generation than the business as usual case. In other words, we have options, right? That was the big underlying conclusion. We can choose strategies that would lead to, help us on the way towards a just transition to a clean energy economy in Kentucky. And as we do so, we can produce better outcomes for our people and for the planet on almost every measure, or on every measure we looked at than the course we're now on. We released the plan in the midst of this extraordinary and difficult political moment. And so the natural question is, where do we go from here? What's next? And unsurprisingly, we are answering that with, we continue to organize. And we are working to build a mosaic of local strategies across the state to implement pieces of the plan wherever possible and to build political will to make the broader political change that we know is needed. So I'll leave it there. Thanks for the opportunity to share this case study. I'm now honored to turn things over to Tom Goldtooth of the Indigenous Environmental Network. And if you push me first.
Thank you, Lisa. My name is Tom Goldtooth. As Lisa had mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Indigenous Environmental Network. We've been around since 1990. Jokingly, I always tell people I'm the janitor. I'm the head janitor with all the keys. And vast amount of people that ask me to speak, talk about these important topics. So IEN is building momentum with an alliance of Native, Indigenous frontline communities to stop fossil fuel and potential uranium, and mining development in their homelands. The campaign, Keep It in the Ground, is also about solutions for a just transition towards revitalizing healthy indigenous communities to exercise power over localized economy and energy, sustainable jobs, food sovereignty, energy efficient affordable housing, and ecosystem protection and restoration, with a spiritual foundation that recognizes our indigenous traditional knowledge. IEN is initiating an indigenous-based just transition campaign. The indigenous principles of just transition that you have been provided in your packet as a newly creative guide for our Native communities and tribal nations of responding to the question that they have is, what is just transition, especially from our Native indigenous perspectives. These principles were compiled from the voices and teachings of indigenous peoples of many tribes, from the decades of our Protecting Mother Earth gatherings that we've held since 1990, and listening to elders, listening to our women, listening to our youth, our traditional practitioners, and especially our spiritual leadership. At this point, I have a short PowerPoint presentation to show you. We're very proud with our demonstration project in Fort Berthold. I don't know if many of you are familiar or who's been to North Dakota, Fort Berthold community? Oh, okay. This is a very exciting project, and we call it a just transition from flooded lands and fracking shale oil to protect, defend, resist, and renew. So we're there on the front lines to protect the sacredness of our Mother Earth and those teachings, but also to defend our treaty rights. We're a rights-based entity in many of our tribes with sovereignty and self-determination, and we will resist when we need to. No DAPO, many Wachoni, and renewing our old ways, which is our new ways, but also recognizing what Chief Simbo said, we got to utilize the tools of the white man that are appropriate. So we're working with the White Shield community and with the vision at Fort Berthold. MHA is Mandan Hadassah Rikara, and we have a grassroots group called POWER, Protectors of Water and Earth Rights. In partnership with White Shield community, is one of 5 communities on the Fort Berthold reservation. Along with IEN, it's a just transition demonstration project that's focusing around building the base. Building the base is very important to us. Many of the members came down and participated in the actions and the struggle to protect the homeland of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. In fact, many people don't know that the frack oil that flows through that Dakota pipeline comes from the homeland of the Mandan Hadassah Rikara. It comes from their land. So it was very important to build that base so that they can learn on the impact of what's happening not only in their home, but what's happening to the Standing Rock and the Lakota, Nakota, Dakota peoples. Part of that building the base is understanding terminology like internalized oppression, that when we do something in development back home on our reservations, we have to deal with the symptoms of colonization. If we don't deal with that symptom, we usually can only go so far. Also, it's a learning curve of understanding the indigenous principles of just transition. We have that document in your folder. And also, one of the foundations for them to make a start is something that is traditionally theirs. Their seeds, their heirlooms, their corn, their squash, their beans, their melons. And they've had that since the time beginning. There's 3 tribes there, Mandan, Hadassah, and the Rikara. Every one of them have a wealth of knowledge, so they want to bring that back. And then building the National Local Community Native Loan Fund, and long range is the energy microgrid system. Look, this is the map of North Dakota. You can see Fort Berthold right there on the reservation. It flows down, the river flows down to Standing Rock. It's been flooded. You can see the Garrison, you can't see the Garrison Dam, which is off reservation in the lower bottom right, but you can see the original river system, the dark blue. That's flooded land that flooded their traditional agricultural lands on the bottom land. It also is the site of the Bakken Shale, the Bakken oil formation. They're right dead center. So this is just some quick photographs. Fort Berthold has approved 1,700 oil and gas leases to date. The lake is in jeopardy. Man camps, pollution, trucks, and accidents. So they're getting hit from many different directions. But talk about cultural and spiritual resilience. Despite all that, they want to organize and build their power for change. We've been working with the community there. They've been having healing walks, bringing back their culture with their corn. And these are some designs being crafted right now on how to build a four-season food production system that embraces their culture and their heritage, looking at different technologies from underground or submerged in the upper right to other different technologies where you stack your food production in these facilities, and also agroponics as well. And also building a center, which will be an earth lodge. We have already purchased the logs. They're going to be coming in this spring. That's going to be the center. And so some, again, some visuals about building this community that in the summertime will be a gathering. People can bring their teepees. And you do see yurts there. Also, energy is very important. Looking at microgrid systems of solar and wind turbine. And that's just a little diagram of a microgrid system where we can have the community developing their own electricity at the local level. And they, as a backup, it can plug into the utility level. I call it the colonial electrical grid system. This again, some of the wind turbines in the back. And when we need to also, you know, looking at wood, looking at different centralized fuel systems that we have in Minnesota. I'm from Minnesota, so we're familiar with how to keep our homes warm in the wintertime. The spiritual foundation is very important. So we wanted to reflect how, as many of our indigenous native people, that center is very important, that cosmovision, that worldview. And again, dealing with all the assimilation and acculturation policies of the federal government to kill the Indian and save the man is very critical. The relationship that we have between the man and the woman is very important. That relationship to the sacredness of Mother Earth is very important. So it also would be a place for summer gatherings and teachings. So building the circle, green affordable housing, native design, worker-owned enterprises and sustainable jobs, education and a training center, localized health and wellness center, and our own daycare center there, and our school and language revitalization and replication to other indigenous communities. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Jesus. Very important message from Puerto Rico.
Agricultura Ecológica. It's an organization that focuses on sustainable farming. So it's a base organization that has farmers, peasants, farm workers, and food sovereignty activists. And so I'm going to share some slides, and it has some pictures that were all taken during the past few weeks after Hurricane Maria hit us. So I'm going to be talking most of the efforts that we've been doing, and also the plans that we have for rebuilding farms and other structures. So we're talking about decentralized mutual support after Hurricane Maria in Organización Boricua. That's just a picture in Orocovis. It's like the mountain region in the central part of the island. And we're doing constant brigades of work brigades just to kind of clean the access for farms in order to get farmers back or to get them out to just do their work. And Boricua is a 28-year-old farmer, peasant, farm worker, and food sovereignty activist organization. And our main mission is to promote food sovereignty and environmental justice on the island. And we are part of communities that practice and educate others about sustainable family farming. And we also protect ancestral Campesino knowledge. We call the Jíbaro knowledge. That's the word in Puerto Rico for like campesinos. And we are part of La Vía Campesina, which is an international movement, and also with the Climate Justice Alliance, working in just transition. So the context in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Irma and Maria in Boricua, we anticipated the impact of these two hurricanes. So we did like a form in order for our members, that it's farmers, most of them, to see what are going to be the necessities. So Irma hit us, but not so much. And then like 2 weeks after we got Maria, so we didn't finish having, organizing all of those necessities, right? So then Maria came like very hard. So we're still having, most of the island that doesn't have electricity. The government is saying like 75%, but we know some of the communities have electricity maybe for 2 days, and it's off for 2 weeks. So it's always, so the vast majority of the island that has no power. And there's low access to water. The communities that have water doesn't have clean water. And especially in the rural part of the island, which is the central part of the island, that it's more than 20 towns, don't have access to water. And that's where many of the farms are. So people are just finding their ways to get spring water and other ways. And we also have a militarized Puerto Rico right now. So, and that's impacting some of the zones that we're working on. And 95% approximately of agriculture is what the Department of Agriculture is saying, that was completely impacted and that it's gone. In agroecology and sustainable agriculture, we're finding pockets of resiliency, right? So sustainable practices have shown up that if you do diversified farming, if you keep part of the forest where you're farming, then you can harvest. You know, some of the farmers are harvesting now, like a lot of like root vegetables, and also trees like orange and grapefruit trees also kind of resisted. And also we have a emigration thing, right? 55,000 people have left the island, and we have, for example, Vieques is a neighbor island of Puerto Rico. More than 4,000 are already out. And we need to be clear that the disaster is not natural, right? In Puerto Rico, we were in an economic crisis before. We're still in an economic crisis before the hurricane hit us. And then we didn't have the structure to kind of protect ourselves from these kinds of impacts. And so we know climate change is real. We know that we're very vulnerable, island people in the Caribbean, to the decisions of governments and societies all over the world. So we do depend on fossil fuels, but we know Puerto Rico is very small. So we're really into like climate justice. It's a big important conversation. It's now, and we're learning now the importance of it. So, and we know that like colonialism, austerity, corruption, capitalism, and the dependence of fossil fuels are really the roots of what we're experiencing now. The Earth is manifesting in some natural ways, but we don't have the structure kind of to protect ourselves. And again, the people are the ones that are resolving their own issues again. So let's do next. Sorry. Okay, these are some quick pictures of some of the fincas. Whenever you see finca, it's farm. So that's in Jayuya, just so that you guys know some of the impacts. That's in Orocovis. That's a landslide. That's just that was the path to get into the farm. It's just like a new mountain just fell. So that's Abrigada, like a working group of people coming into the farm to help. That's the same part. So you can see at the top of the mountain, one of the houses of the farmers, and you can see the structure at the right. It was a little house. It's completely, only the skeleton of the house, it's there. And the landslide, so they're not able to even farm their farm because they cannot get in. This is also in Orocovis, which is the central part of the island. These are houses that are completely destroyed. Also, this is near the city of San Juan, only like a 20-minute drive away. A lot of the infrastructures of the farms are down, like ranches. This is like a before and after picture in Patillas. This is the same farm. This is just, this was like 2 days before the hurricane. You can see like the little house and you can see the view of the forest and now how it's looking, just to have a glimpse of what the impact was. This is one of the founding members of Organización Boricua, Edgardo Alvarado. He's on the top, and the top of that house was really the house. They were living on the top side of the house. Down was more for storage, so they're living now on storage, and they're having a problem also with like rats and stuff because they're trying to get in. So we're also doing rebuilding brigades just to address the issues. So in terms of our plan, we have like a short-term and mid-term and long-term plan. So right now we're addressing direct and immediate support to supply the needs of food, water, and shelter. Short to mid-term, we're doing brigades, working brigades, almost one day, then a 3-day, then brigade again. Mid-term, rebuild infrastructures like ranches, houses, etc. And long-term, support our organization's infrastructure. Keep going the ideas of accessing land, buying land, having more a structure to address all of these needs in the future, because we know we're very vulnerable. So and brigades, I'll just show you some picture of the work that we're doing. Brigades is the birth of our organization. It's just going to farms and helping each other and establishing a community of farmers. Agroecological farmers and sustainable farmers in Puerto Rico has been alone. They don't have a support from institutions in the state because the model does not fit. So before the hurricane, they were raising a flag. We're vulnerable in our food system. 85% of the food from Puerto Rico comes from abroad. So there's been an emphasis on harvesting food by the people to the people of Puerto Rico. And now we have the hurricane, so we feel it's a huge responsibility to give back to the work of organizing that has been going for 28 years, right? So this is just like some of the equipment that we take to the brigadas. This is just, we needed to cross the river 3 times in order to help that farmer that is part of our base. This is also in Orocovis. We are having technical support with a lot of chainsaw work just to clear the paths to get into the farms. And we're also started farming again, you know, planting. So a lot of like cutting. This is before, this is 1 day of work. So that's at night. I took that picture 2 weeks ago at 9 a.m. And this is that same land at like 3 p.m. And we even like planted the seed, a lot of root vegetables during that day. And farmers are like, they don't know how to start. So when they get to their home, it's like, it's very emotional. So when you receive a group of pictures of persons that are your friends and like comrades, it's very like uplifting. So we're dealing also with like emotional and moral support. This is also the work of 2 days. And this is more in the city in San Juan and more brigades. So, and then we're dealing with support center. We've formed a support center with other social justice collectives to kind of address the needs. So we've been having food just to take it over to the farms. A lot of youth are involved in this leadership, and we're receiving a lot of communities from the diaspora, and also like Climate Justice Alliance and other groups have been helped just like supporting the needs. So we're receiving seeds and equipment just to get things going. And these are just some of the pictures of filtering water to get to some houses that have like premature babies that the government right now is not addressing. So we were kind of covering all angles that we can. This is doing an inventory of seeds and some of the visits that we do with other social justice groups that are our allies, right? And this is just dealing with the signal and electricity, so with solar energy, so more meetings. And this is just like some pictures at the end of the brigades of volunteers and also members of organization just coming in to help. And some of the work that we do, saving what we can. And this was in Orocovis. This was in Jayuya. And yeah, that's just like the contact information if you guys are interested in knowing more about our organization or emailing. So that's the information. So that's it for now. So thank you all.
You can leave it on. Great. So I'm Rachel Young. I'm with the Mertz Gilmore Foundation. We are very happy to be co-hosting this event, and I'm going to be moving us through a question and answer. But first, just want to give a round of applause to all the great speakers. So it looks like we have about a little over half an hour for questions and discussion. Let's take a couple from the room, and then Marian, maybe you can help me take a couple from the Zoom. And when you ask a question, please just say your name and organization, and if your question is directed toward any of the individual speakers, please indicate that. I think I'll take the moderator's prerogative and kick us off. And I guess I'm going to disregard my own instructions because this is directed to anyone who wants to take a crack at it, which is all of your organizations are part of the same larger movement, just play different roles, complementary roles. So just be interested to hear any of you speak to and how you're in relationship to one another, how you support each other, how you learn from each other.
Yeah. Well, this is Michelle again for those on the phone. I think, like I said earlier, it's been so crucial. I think we've developed such a space of cross collaboration and learning from one another, and there's no way that even this frame of just transition would have gotten off the ground if not for the deep work rooted in place, like the work of the Kentuckians, like the work of Black Mesa Water Coalition, which has been advancing just transition on many different timescales, for years, the work of IEN, et cetera, and what's been, I think what's important about the way the Climate Justice Alliance has formed and, and many of the networks that we're all engaging in is that it's really a translocal movement rather than a national movement. So it's, in other words, we're identifying, our folks are identifying what are the solutions that make sense in the time, place, and conditions here, and then how can we learn from each other across localities in ways that can scale up our, leverage our power in those localities in ways that will actually make greater impact nationally. So I think that's been a really important, and so all kinds of learning spaces, all kinds of, campaigns or, initiatives that we've formed, that developing the Energy Democracy Platform through CJA, other folks can talk to some of the other initiatives, but I think that sense of being rooted in place gives us many lessons that we need to actually be learning from together, and then how we translate that in ways that create a shared set of strategies, a common narrative and messaging, and then a clear sense of where we're going, a collective vision for where we're heading. Yeah.
I think also as CJ, we recognize the role that not only base building groups need to play, but also the role of movement support organizations and alliances play in the just transition to be able to amplify it. And a lot of the work that we're committed to doing right now is actually building out the foundational wisdom and the tools needed to actually influence some of the alliances that are part of the Climate Justice Alliance, but also partner with a lot of other national movements that are considering just transition for the first time, and that might not have that EJ background, but are really interested in moving into clean energy or looking at housing from a different perspective, or looking at their public transportation, transit solutions. And so we see that part as being really critical, and focused on building more of a larger network, right? We know that CJ alone, I've said this 1,000 times before, cannot do it alone. We need to have other folks that are involved in different sectors to do that.
Thank you. Who have a question? I saw one down here and then over here. And can I ask you to, do these mics.
I have two questions. First, I would like to ask you all the initiatives that you presented. What do you consider your key strategies to mobilize your communities and to build your base, to build your communities? Is one of the hardest things to do, and it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources. So what are the key strategies in all of your initiatives that were presented you can highlight? And the other one is you somehow answered the other one question is, how did you connect these local initiatives, proposals that you're providing, into the larger energy agenda that is based on the fossil fuels and extractive industry that is not only negatively impacting the U.S., but also is impacting other countries in Latin America and Asia and Africa?
Can you just say your name?
Oh, my name is Angela Martinez, and I'm from the International Funders for Indigenous People.
Okay.
Can you phrase the second question? I think I got it, but I don't think. One more time.
Oh, how do you connect your local initiatives into a larger energy agenda, the campaign agenda, to question this energy agenda based on fossil fuels and extractive industry, blah, blah, blah?
I'm going to use two mics. I think one of the things that our Indigenous network really felt good about in joining forces with other allies like the Climate Justice Alliance, Grassroots for Global Justice, and now Rights to the City Alliance, is we have a shared vision, and we have a history of addressing the issues of climate, and especially from an environmental justice frame. The CJA was a good vehicle of where we have frontline communities, people of color communities, working class, and initiatives to work with labor around these challenges. So when we came together to kind of look at where are we going collectively, especially around a solution base, and taken our experience with some of our organization members of CJA and GGJ that founded the Just Transition Alliance years ago, which IEN was part of, and some other environmental justice networks, working with OCA, the Oil Chemical Atomic Workers Union, which later became PACE, which became the Steelworkers. We found that there's a value when we bring the rank and file in together with communities who live along the fence line of polluting industry that the workers work for. It was a test situation, in a demonstration project in many ways. But that's all the need for us to come together and have that critical analysis. So I want to put some value to that. And back to building power is a very important concept with indigenous peoples from the north, from the belly of the beast of the United States, is that people say, well, we respect your ethics, we respect your moral position around the relationship with Mother Earth, your traditional knowledge, but let's be practical. There's always that little term, let's be practical. So how do we build political base? And for those of us from the EJ movement, it's building that base of power as people of color and frontline communities, poor white folks, working class and labor, and build that base. And that's established a door opener for us to stand with the bigger environmental movement, for an example, the People's Climate March, the one in New York City, and recently this past year, the one in Washington, D.C. So I wanted to flag those as very important, to really be strategic and very critical in how we move forward. We've learned a lot of lessons on how to do that, but also very tactical. So that's some of the things that how we have organized ourselves, both as indigenous, but also as people of color and working class communities. Thank you.
Did anyone else want to respond to that one?
Thanks, Tom. I would just, this is Lisa Abbott, and I would just briefly add that in our work, the core strategies are strategies of community organizing. So one-to-one conversations really are the foundation of how we approach building our base. And then from there, leadership training, certainly leadership development is a core strategy for building power. So that takes place in trainings. It also takes place in terms of involving community leaders in analyzing the conditions that they find themselves in and building a plan about what are we going to do about it. That in and of itself is leadership development. And then taking direct action, et cetera. I would say we are in this moment deeply proud of, in our case, 36 years of that work, and deeply aware of the insufficiency, right, of the power that we've been able to build as strong and valiant as the effort is. And so we're constantly trying to maintain the core values and character of the organization and figure out how do we stretch, how do we grow, how do we incorporate other constituencies, but also other strategies. And it's not a new strategy, but it is one that we find ourselves returning to again and again. I think incorporating art and culture in our organizing work as a way of reaching and touching and more people and creating opportunities for people to express their vision for themselves and their communities has been very important in the last 30 years, but especially I would say in the last 10 years for us as a strategy. And then to address your second question, I think CJA for our organization has been critically important in how do we begin to make the connections between our local experiences in communities and the experiences of other EJ communities in this country, indigenous communities, and globally. And so we have a saying in Eastern Kentucky in the mountains, people live in hollers. If you look at the word, it's spelled out hollows, but we call it hollers. And the space between the mountains. And one of our longtime leaders says, everywhere I go, it's the same story, it's just a different holler, right? And so that ability to begin to see that the experiences that we know well, living in one extractive economy, have a relationship to hollers around the world.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, those are such great questions. So I just want to add to those helpful Tom and Lisa. The other, I think, key thing that a lot of the groups involved in the Climate Justice Alliance and many other groups around the U.S. now are taking on is really looking at how we can build our economic power and wield that as political power. So I want to mention again the local loan funds that folks are developing. So last week, Cooperation Richmond just launched, which is an amazing incubator and loan fund in Richmond, California, that the Asian Pacific Environmental Network and Urban Tilth and Rich City Rights and many other, Movement Generation, many other groups in Richmond in that area have been building. IEN, of course, Tom just mentioned the Indigenous loan funds that they're involved in helping to launch. CJA is launching a Just Transition Loan Fund in this next period. There's many, many others around the country. The Working World here in New York City is one of the models that we've been learning a lot from about non-extractive finance and how we make sure that the way that we're shifting capital is not just replicating extractive processes, because finance itself, as we can see here, close to Wall Street, it is a tool of extraction if wielded that way. And so developing new models of non-extractive finance is critical to how that capital is shifted. And then that's not just to build alternatives, right? It's not just about building worker co-ops on the margins of this extractive system. We've got to actually organize our bases within, as we're building that economic power to be able to then wield that to change the rules, right? Because the rules right now are stacked against communities, applying our labor and using these resources in ways that are in accordance with well-being. And so that's a critical component that we are very much engaged in as this next phase of how we build our base. Because that's what people want. They want to just be doing good work that is meaningful and that is healing to their communities and to the places that they live. And so that's what we've got to do. The next thing I wanted to just mention just briefly is around energy. And what we like to talk about at MG is this framework that really comes from Vandana Shiva and many other folks around the world that is, we've got to democratize, decentralize, diversify, right? Not we were talking about this, not like from silver bullets to either silver BBs or silver buckets, you know, but what are the tools, of the plethora of tools that we have, and then damper down our energy use, right? The demand, and redistribute. So those are like the kind of ways that we see needing to shift, but also the energy is not just electricity, and it's not just the fuels that go into the vehicles or for transportation, right? Energy comes in all different forms, right? Food is energy, you know, food is the energy we need every morning when we get up. And so what is our food system? How do we shift our food system to be off of industrial, you know, scale tractors and onto human scale labor in ways that are much more in accordance with energy systems that are place-based. So I encourage folks to get a copy of this new book that just came out last week called Energy Democracy, which many folks in the Climate Justice Alliance and many of our allies have been involved in writing. It's co-edited by Denise Fairchild and Al Weinreb. And check out that book. It's called Energy Democracy.
One more call out into a publication. So we're also working on this publication that we talked about that's going to be released at COP23 that actually talks about the energy systems and the danger that we see in the carbon markets, both at an international level and a national level, uniting and becoming monopolies, and the need that we have here in the U.S. for assuring that communities are able to understand what those markets look like, to understand what these initiatives, these energy initiatives actually hold, and to provide solutions that are more based around microgrids and community control of that energy. And we're basing that publication off the deep lived experiences of Global South, indigenous peoples from Colombia, Brazil, and other places that have been through the experience that we in the U.S. are going through right now in terms of carbon markets and the monopolization of the energy initiatives across the U.S.
Thank you. And I saw another question in the room, and then I'll take a couple that are coming in off of Zoom. Here, and then.
Thank you. My name is Peter Broker. I'm with the Lifetime Foundation. Mm-hmm. And I'm coming more from a climate change perspective on listening to you. Can I just talk? Or?
Yep,
yeah.
Talk.
Mostly I want to ask any of you who want to respond, how you think about the rate of change. In the climate world, there's many good things going on in the world of solutions and hopeful pockets and areas, and whether it's technology or agriculture or land use, all kinds of new practices or rediscovering the old practices. But the question to my mind is the rate of change. You know, there are a lot of studies saying, well, these next 3 years are crucial, or 5 to 10 years is crucial. I don't know what the number is, but some period of time that's not too far away is getting to be very crucial, at least from the CO2 emissions point of view. So in your work, how do you think about, you know, without going into a panic, how do you think about the rate of change? Or I guess I would ask you, if you could do one or more than one thing that you're aware of to amplify and accelerate, how do you think about that? What would you most want to have happen from, you know, people interested in helping?
It's a topic that's dear to the work that I do in our network. I think a time doesn't go by when we hear more voices from our relatives from the Arctic Circle. Something that was really touching to me a couple of years ago was a friend that I had made friendship with this Inupiat man from up near Barrow, Alaska, and later had worked his way into being a whaling captain. And you don't just get to achieve that status of a whaling captain in 4 years, 5 years. It's a lifelong challenge, and ever since he's been a youth. And he was very touched with the situation. He knows the ice. He thought he knew the ice culture. And he lost one of the men out there on the sea, on the ice, because the unpredictability of the weather, the melting of the ice of the north. We hear the permafrost that's melting. So from that place space, that observation of people from the local community who know the environment is changing so rapidly, and it's not within the norm. So we hear that, you know, and where I come from in northern Minnesota, the ricing, we're always concerned about the rice, the conditions and the seasons. In Wisconsin for a while there, because there was no water in the rice beds, they were using snowshoes to go and walk out on the rice and paddle off the rice. And so it's coming to be extreme. So back to upcoming COP23, we have to organize, and that's what we're doing at Climate Justice Alliance, and along with brothers and sisters from the Global South, because it's a human rights issue now. And we've been participating in the previous UN meetings, and even leading up to the Paris Agreement, is that the countries did not want any strong language in the operating text on human rights. When it's a human rights issue, they did not want to respect the rights of indigenous peoples. It's in the preamble statement of the Paris Agreement, but it has no meat to it. It's not in the operative text. So what do we do as we work with other climate organizations, NGOs who are going to the COP, when we know that the ambitions, the targets also have no meat to it? So how do we organize, and what's the strategy? And get some common ground with the climate NGOs who go. Why is it that we do struggle? We do struggle try to find a common ground from grassroots, from frontline communities around an agenda where it's a life and death issue. And it's an economic issue. Some of us were there in Cochabamba in 2010, coming out of a failed international climate meeting, Copenhagen, COP9. And that's when a lot of the foundations pumped, I don't know how many, millions of dollars into a climate strategy coming out of the United States, and it failed in Copenhagen. Where have we gone since Copenhagen to Paris? And now the implementation of the Paris Agreement. As Indigenous Environmental Network and It Takes Roots delegation of our alliances, we have said that the Paris Agreement is not good enough. It's going to lead to a crime against humanity and Mother Earth. It's that drastic and that serious. But it gets into the debates when we try to develop a political strategy in the US with how power politics plays out and how money flows. And back to Cochabamba, there was a consensus of the participants, which included developing countries, that capitalism is the root cause of climate change. So how do we embrace that challenge here in the United States when we look at an economic system that is not sustainable? How do we shift away from capitalism? So those are some challenges, at least, that we are embracing with our alliances, to have that discussion with Movement Generation and other groups that have a good handle on that critical analysis of economics and economic justice. That's just a brief response to that question. The ambitions is the problem. It's not a legally binding agreement. It's not a treaty. We got the national determination contributions, and it's not going to get us there right now. It's a report card session this coming COP, and the way the figures are, we're going to go way above like 3.5 degrees, 4 degrees. How do we get back down to an ambition of not only 2.0, but 1.5? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm sure other panelists have thoughts on that question, but there's a lot of questions coming in on the Zoom and in the room. So I want to take another question in the room, and then panelists feel free to chime in on, maybe I'll take 2 questions in the room. I know, Sarah, you had one. And
there's one behind you too.
Okay, so 1, 2, and name and organization, please.
My name is Sarah Stranahan. I'm on the board of the Stranahan Foundation, but I'm also the chair of the New Economy Coalition, and I work for the Democracy Collaborative. So I do a lot of work on economic transition. This is a question primarily for Jesus, but also for the rest of you. When we see that the devastation of infrastructure, where's the conversation about the opportunity to rebuild an energy democracy in Puerto Rico? And why are we not organizing our resources politically and philanthropically, if necessary, so that when we have the devastation of the old system, we can actually demonstrate what a more resilient, community-based, democratic, distributed system would look like?
Okay, can you hold your response for just 1 second while I get another question out of the room? There's a mic back here. Push the button.
Hi, my name is Natalie Margie. I work with a group called Urgent Action Fund. Thank you so much for your presentation and especially for your work. So we are a small feminist activist fund. We make small grants to frontline women human rights defenders, both in the US and the rest of the world. And so it's been really useful to hear you, Michelle, talk about economic power. That's really our mission, to change, to make economic power become political power, and also to hear about, the human rights advocacy that's happening at the UN. I have two questions. One, in your work, have you noticed a lot of gender-specific impacts to what's happening? And second, so we make small grants in two cases. One, when there are urgent security needs or security threats. And two, when there's unanticipated advocacy opportunities that are really timely. We used to make mostly grants outside of the US, and in the US, it used to be only advocacy grants. Sadly, some of you were alluding to this political moment. We saw a 300% increase in security grants in the US of groups getting threatened or assaulted for their work. I'm just wondering, are you facing security threats, or are groups that you're working with facing security threats? Thanks.
So thanks to Jesus, and then Michelle, and I'll ask you, if we are starting to quickly run out of time, ask you to keep your responses to maybe 2 or 3 minutes each, so we can get 1 or 2 more.
Okay, so yeah, that's a great question, and especially within the environmental justice movement and agroecological movement in Puerto Rico, because that has been the base that has been giving this message before we have these moments of extreme crisis, right? So, but for us, it's been very challenging within the scope of just transition to keep up the communication as we would have wanted, because we don't have signal, just phone signal or internet signal to communicate at many parts of the island, especially anywhere outside of San Juan. So we're feeling a responsibility to kind of do the work that is needed to be done in the farm. So we're camping, we're out of reach, even like 2 days or 3 days in a row. But it's very important because the eyes are now on the island, and talking about transition, it's heavy even without a disaster on top of you. But talking about just transition and knowing that now the conditions are kind of there and not there, because we cannot communicate as we want, but we're seeing it like so evidently. So, but we've been just in the conversation. We've been with all this support that we call it decentralized support. We're working with solar energy. We're bringing more solar energy and ways to harvest water to farms that maybe didn't have like the budget to do it, but they knew that was the way. And also keeping the work on education, because in Puerto Rico, it's the clean energy public policy. It's being run by the government. They don't put any it's not a serious conversation to them. So yeah, we're definitely seeing that angle right now, that the moment is now. So that's why we're trying to kind of have the responsibility that we have locally, that it's kind of our base, and then keeping up with all these conversations that are coming from abroad. And also the colonial context in Puerto Rico is very hard, because we have the military, we have the federal government, and we have a corrupt local government. And for us, our base is our familia, so So we feel extreme responsibility to respond to people that we love and that we're part of a community. But at the same time, there's some public policy issues that we're kind of more used to dealing before the hurricane. But yeah, it's kind of a challenge, but I think it's a very important conversation to keep having and finding ways to have those families and those communities that are completely self-sufficient. And we're working on that. And so CJA also has been very helpful on that.
Yeah, I think both to respond to your question and to the question of the gentleman that just spoke before about where is the urgency, when we think about energy abuse and we think about industrial agriculture, Puerto Rico is at the, the tipping point of both of those things, in addition to, federal debt and the implications of what the Jones Act means for an island like this. And so we have been saying, we know from Katrina that there are our power communities, which is how we reference place-based communities that are working on just transition, that have a lot of lessons learned and that they need to be sharing with other communities. And so when Irma hit, we brought in and had a members call where members themselves start talking about what this moment means for just transition, what this moment means for climate action and climate justice. And so, we worked with our Tejas in Houston. We've worked with the Farmers Association in Florida. And then some of our members also had other Caribbean members in both the U.S. Virgin Islands and in Haiti, who are all experiencing this. The urgency is real. There's no other conversation that we could be having now that doesn't include a conversation about climate disasters. And it's unfortunate that even the media doesn't call them climate disasters or calling them natural disasters. And there's really nothing natural about these disasters. And so our goal is to say, hey, you can see the disaster capitalism already happening on the island. Elizabeth Jean-Pierre from Uprose and Naomi Klein both co-wrote an article in The Intercept that talks about what Puerto Rico would look like if communities like Organización Boricua actually led what the recovery efforts could be in a just way. And so we've launched this campaign. I mean, it's been a super exciting campaign to be working on, focusing on the actual communities on the ground. And we're having a delegation of our power communities going down. There's a number of donors and foundations that are donating equipment, but we know equipment is just one part of the equation. We need to ensure that the equipment that's going down or the energy infrastructure that's being built is by Puerto Ricans for Puerto Ricans, and that there's actually workers on the ground that can maintain those kinds of microgrids or any kind of infrastructure that's going down. And then we hope to bring that back to the States and have a debrief of that conversation that Puerto Ricans are having, U.S. Virgin Island residents are having, and those in the South to say, what's going to happen next year? Because there's no doubt that this is happening again next year. So we really appreciate it, folks that are in the room that's helped us have that conversation moving towards that, but that's how we're making the connections.
Okay, so can you answer in maybe 2 minutes? Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, my response was to the earlier question about how do we scale transition. And I would say 2 things. The first thing is turn over philanthropic endowments to the control of frontline communities and allow those communities to invest those resources in transition. Because these folks, like the groups on the ground, have been developing solutions for many, many years, and the plans are in place. The will is there on the side of the membership base. We need a little bit more support around capacity building and technical assistance, like Jesus was referring to. But the expertise is there. We just need the capital to move. So that's number one. Again, to reference the point about building our economic power and wielding that as political power, that's a core part of what we're going to need to make that happen, and to scale up the political will for transition. The second thing I would say is support the intersections of movement building. So environmental justice groups have deep roots in place and amazing expertise and capacity, and like that's not the entire base of the frontline communities, right? We need other ways to appeal to folks, and not just and I'm referring to frontline communities because we believe that that is who needs to lead the transition, but that all of us are in the same boat that we call planet Earth. And so it needs to be a multi-class, multiracial, sector, project of transition. But one of the ways we make that happen is by creating more spaces for our movements to cross-pollinate. So an example of that, Movement Generation has been, working with the Blackout Collective over the last 2 years on an initiative called Black Land and Liberation. And in that space grew out of the fact that organizers in the Black Lives Matter movement and Movement for Black Lives were clear that it's not enough. I mean, it's critical and it's important to assert this conversation of Black Lives Matter. And the core of the crisis is land. That if Black folks had land to self-determine, we would be in a very different position. That folks could have self-determination around, criminal justice, quote unquote, right? And and alternatives to harm and hurting. And that if people were able to self-govern in those kinds of spaces, we would be in a very different place. And through that conversation, there's been many opportunities to cross dialogues with environmental justice and critically this framework of just transition, which is not just about environment, it's about the whole system, right? And so many other folks, organizers in different kinds of movements, new formations that are forming, especially collectives of folks that are just rooted in all kinds of different ways of moving and organizing, especially through cultural work and all different forms that are reaching a much broader audience and larger audience. That's a critical intersection and a critical space to support.
Thank you. If we didn't get your question in the room, please write it down on one of the note cards in front of you. And if you're on Zoom, we do have your questions and we'll respond to them. One of those questions which you began to address, thank you, Michelle, already, which was what would you ask of funders or philanthropists who would like to be allies in this work? And so maybe as I turn it over to Angela for our closing, I'll ask you to speak to that question as we close out.
Great. Maybe we make that part of the closing. So I think a couple of things that we ask funders is that you continue to advocate for a just transition that looks at the transition of renewable energy, but also looks at the social and economic conditions that we need to attach to that kind of transition. Another ask that we had earlier on was just to continue to hold these conversations within your own sector and explore, like Shake the Foundations does, how we can continue moving philanthropy into bolder and more aligned relationships with the grassroots. And the B has been part of that discussion, but there's a number of people that I just look around the room here and just I'm really grateful for continuing to hold that space with us. I want to share both deep gratitude to the JPB Foundation and to Mertz Gilmore, both Dana and Rachel who are in the room right here for helping us hold this space. And all the other funder allies that have been supporting CJ's vision and mission from the very beginning. Wanted to mention a couple of subsequent briefings that we're going to be having. Obviously, there was a lot of interest, and I know there's a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to, but the subsequent briefings are going to start becoming more kind of pointed to some of the questions that were uplifted in this conversation today. So the second briefing that we're talking about, Just Transition in, is focused on climate action strategies, and that's going to happen December 13th in Washington, D.C. The third briefing is actually talking about organizing new economies on the ground. So that's a question about reinvestment and how do we continue supporting groups and where do you get the money for Just Transition from. The fourth briefing is going to be around cultivating climate disaster capacity, a long-term just recovery assessment. And that's happening in March, hopefully in a place-based community in 2018, March 2018. The final thing I want to remind folks and ask, this is probably the biggest ask, is that you do participate in the Just Transition Forum that the B is holding on February 26th in Jackson, Mississippi. Because what we need most when it comes to just transition is space for dialogue and deep, deep understanding of both the historical context, but also the visioning that we have for a just transition in the future that includes all our sectors. And so the goals of that forum in Jackson are to align, obviously, and create visionary systemic change narratives that unite both the workers and communities around a just transition, to point out the climate and energy policy strategies that are rooted in local wisdom and priorities, and then develop organizing strategies to shift investments to economies that serve people and planet. Ultimately, when we think about just transition, it's about creating that just transition, but also being able to resource that just transition. And so we hope in that forum, and Molly, once again, is here on the corner, one of the co-chairs of the B, we'll be able to deep dive together around the just transition. So appreciation for everyone at the table and folks that are on the Zoom, deep appreciation to Marion and Holly who helped us create this space, and all the funders here. May we continue walking together. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't think it would be great to go around your name, who you're with. We didn't get to do that with that many people on the video.